video. So slump molding is when you take an object, and that object could really be literally anything. It could be made out of plastic, it could be made out of wood, it could even be made out of a lump of clay. The concept of a slump mold is that you take this thing that's already kind of got a shape to it, and you roll out a slab, and you lay that slab over top of that shape, and you let it dry somewhat, right, to like a pre-leather hard state. So that it holds that shape, and then you lift it off, and all of a sudden you have this thing that is pre-molded, right? So I want you today and this week to be making a bowl. So think about a bowl. Think about kind of the same idea around, well, what are we drinking out of our mug, right? What is the functionality of the mug? What are the elements of the mug that need to be functional so that I can use it? I want you to think the same way about your bowl. So choose something that you eat in bowls all the time. You know, it could be cereal, could be ice cream, could be pasta, could be salad, could be anything really. And I want you to design a bowl based on that particular food. So I eat a lot of like mixed things, mixed bowls. So like I'll heat up something, I'll have like a stir fry of rice and veggies, and then I might throw a bunch of cold stuff on top, like sprouts and other colds, you know, avocado and cilantro, stuff like that. So I like bowls that are fairly good size because I put a lot of good stuff in that bowl. So I chose, this is a plastic slip container, and I just really kind of like the squared off nature of it. You know, it's really got a foot kind of built into it already. It's hard for you to see because it's so white, but there's a foot right here. And then the bowl is going to come kind of straight up. Now the neat thing about this too is that you don't have to necessarily keep the shape that your slump mold is in. You can kind of bend it and shape it after you take it off. And you have to take it off at a certain time because what's happening to that clay when it's drying? Does anyone remember what happens to your clay when it dries? You can shout it out or put it in the chat. What happens to your clay when it dries? Lauren, what happens to your clay when it dries? Lots of things. Think about the fact that it's slumped over something. What could be a problem? It's too hard to use, that's true. You can't manipulate it, that's true. It cracks, So but why is it getting hard and cracking? What's happening to your clay when it's drying? I don't want to give you guys the answer. I feel like you should know the answer to this already. What have I been talking about? Your clay, it moves, right? What is clay, right? It's clay particles, but what is surrounding that clay particle? Giancarlo, what's surrounding that clay particle when your clay is wet?
I'm not sure.
Okay, well think about it. Listen to the question again. What is surrounding your clay particle when the clay is wet?
Is it the object?
No.
Water.
Water. Water, right? And what happens when the water evaporates to the clay particles? Right? These are two clay particles, and you have water in between them, and the water disappears.
There's air between?
No. Those clay particles come together. And so what happens when your entire sculpture or your vessel, whatever you're making, is the water evaporates. Your clay particles get closer together, and your piece shrinks. Exactly. It took us a while to get there, but yes, it's going to shrink. So if you have your clay wet slab over top of something that doesn't shrink, what's going to happen to it? Valeria, what's going to happen to your clay if you put it over something that's not going to shrink? Any guesses? It breaks. It's going to crack, right? So this is the trick with slump molds. You have to pull it off your mold before it cracks. So you have to learn like when that's going to happen, and I would say pre-leather hard. So it has to hold its shape, right? Because if you pull it off the mold and you put it down on the table and it flops over, you've pretty much kind of like not left it on here long enough, right? Because you want it to hold that shape. But if you leave it on there too long, it's just going to crack, or it could get stuck. It's going to shrink and get stuck to your piece, and you're going to have to break it to get it off. Especially if it has undercuts, and that's something that you learn about in ceramics too when you make molds, is that when you're pulling a hard mold off of something you've cast and there's something that bends underneath and it catches it and you can't pull it up, that's called an undercut. So the same kind of goes for a slump mold, right? So you have to be able to bend it to take it off. So, and it's also going to stick to whatever you're making. So there's a couple techniques that will allow you to make sure it doesn't stick. So if I'm using plastic, I could put paper towel over top, right? But then guess what? The paper towel is going to leave an impression in my clay. And I might want this really nice like surface or this foot to be kind of pushed into my clay. So if I don't want that, I could maybe use a plastic bag that's maybe a little less rigid than the paper, but that's still going to leave some marks. So you have options, but you probably will have to do a little cleanup. So the first thing you're going to do is find your object and think about what you want to put in it. Make sure it's going to fit that thing you want to put in it. And then you're going to roll out a slab. And that slab should be like, I'd say maybe 3/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch, because then we're going to press some texture into it after that before we slump it over. So that's one of the perks of doing slab work that's slumped, is that you can put a cool texture in it before you put it on the slump. So ceramics too, you are also doing this, but your bowl has to be at least 12 inches from rim to rim. So you're making a big bowl or something like maybe like family size plate of spaghetti, or maybe you like to do the basil and the mozzarella, or you've got appetizers or bruschetta or something like that. Just think about what you're going to be serving. So, and you also have to consider how much clay do I need to roll out. I always like to roll out a little bit more than I'm going to need, so that because I want to cut it off and maybe add things to it after I slump it. So I probably will be adding the rim, and I'll probably be adding feet to it, and maybe even handles, depending on what I'm going for here. So ceramics one, don't go too crazy with your size, because you will run out of clay. But ceramics two, I want you to go a little bigger. That's your challenge, and you do have more clay than ceramics one students do. Always wrap up your clay good. I want it to dry out. All right, I'm going to take my ripped up piece of clay here. I'm just going to drop it down and press it. Wedge it up. Now this is especially important if you are using clay that you've used before. You don't want any air bubbles or dry patches or pockets of clay. Might be a good idea to practice wedging bigger pieces too. If you're going big, try to wedge up that bigger piece of clay. Did you guys notice in one of those Potters of the USA videos that he was wedging? He had a wire on his wedging table, and he was putting his piece over the wire, and it was cutting it in half, and then he was drop one half down and then drop the other half on top of it. Then he'd pick it up and cut it with the wire again and throw it down, and that's how he was wedging his clay. I've been taught that technique too. A lot of potters do that. So they're basically using gravity and kind of cutting the clay in half and restacking it to wedge their clay. It's pretty hypnotic to watch too. And it's a little easier than this technique physically, because you're basically just throwing it down instead of like wrestling with it. Okay. So before I roll a slab out, I like to get my piece of clay more uniform. So I'm just going to kind of make a big cube, rectangular cube. Okay. Now, when you're rolling out a bigger slab, you're going to need a surface. So hopefully you guys have a surface at home that will work for you. And some of you might not have a rolling pin, or maybe you have a rolling pin that your family doesn't want you to use for clay. If that's the case, you can use, I use a glass or plastic cup from the kitchen. That works too. It's a little bit more challenging, but it works. I'm going to clean off my rolling pin. I never want to have any hard pieces of clay get into my nice clean slab. I do it this way too instead of running it under the sink, because if I put a bunch of water on my rolling pin, rolling pin's pretty porous wood, and it's going to soak up all that water and it's just going to stick to my slab. So it's much better to have a dry rolling pin to use. Then I'm going to do a little bit of what I call throwing out the slab before I roll it. So we were talking about clay particles earlier. So those clay particles are sitting next to each other with water around them, and they're shrinking, but they're not all the same direction and the same shape and size. So they're all kind of like willy-nilly overlapping each other inside the clay, right? So if you roll them all out in one direction and they start drying, they're going to warp in one direction and create kind of like a curve in your drawing. But if you throw out your slab in different directions, you're kind of forcing those particles to do this instead of this, and that makes for a better web of particles. So when it dries, it has a tendency not to warp as much. So I'm just picking my slab up and I'm kind of like tossing it in all different directions, moving it around my surface so that I don't stick it to one part of the table. And you'll notice that it starts to get skinny around the edges and it's fatter in the middle. That starts happening, that's when you want to start using your rolling pin. And I'm just basically pushing on the middle right now. A couple rolls, and then at this point you really got to move it where it's going to stick. I'm thinking about my slump mold, how big it is, and what the shape of it is, and how far I want to go up for my bowl. I want to kind of keep this shape. If I get any dry pieces of clay in there, I can just dig them out. Trying to keep the thickness the same throughout the slab. Just being very controlled about where I put my pressure. I continue to move it around on the table. As I'm rolling, you can see I start from my fingertips and I go to my wrist. I want it to be about 1/2 inch thick, 3/4 of an inch thick, because we're going to press some texture into it, which will make it thinner. Flip it over, roll the other side. Now when you slump a flat piece of clay over top of a round slump, You're going to have areas where it like wants to fold in on itself and it's going to be thicker. So there's a certain amount of cleanup work that has to be done when you use the slump molds.
Miss Manager,
Yeah.
I have a question. Can it be the same texture that you used on your cup?
Are you trying to match your cup with your bowl?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. I do want you to experiment a little bit, but if you're going for, if you have an aesthetic reason for making that choice, that's fine.
Okay, thank you.
I know you get kind of attached to your vessels, right? And all of a sudden you want to make a set, and you want to make something for your mom, or you want something to use at home. Like, we get attached to these things, which is good. It's good to feel that way about the things you're making. And I really do hope that we can glaze these pieces and fire them in the classroom so you guys can take them home and use them. I'm hoping, if you guys come back for hybrid, then we will fire and glaze your work. If that doesn't happen, then I still will fire it for you at the end of the year, but we won't be able to glaze it. And you can always take your work into places in Sacramento that you can glaze it there. Like Alpha Ceramics has glazes, and they have a studio, and you can take your pieces in there and buy some glaze and glaze it, and they'll fire it for you. Of course, they charge you, but Okay, so my slab is, it's actually a little thinner than 1/2 inch, but that's okay if that happens too. Just make sure when you roll your texture into it that it's not too thin. So now I'm going to clean it up a little bit, or texturize it. Maybe I'll even take this tool and I'll run. You guys can kind of see a little bit what I'm doing here. Trying to clean it up and texturize it. Now remember too, this is a functional vessel, so you don't want your textures on the inside of the bowl to be too deep, because then bacteria will get stuck in there. So after I texturize it, maybe I'll do like a plaid thing where I go one direction and then I go the other direction. After I do that, I might go back over with my rolling pin and just make it a little bit smoother. So it's still there, but it's not grooved. Yes, you do have to put a texture in both the inside and the outside of your bowl, okay? That's a technique I'm trying to teach you. All right, so now I'm very carefully, because I want to put texture on the other side. Actually, I'm not done with this. I want more texture. So I am not going to use the same one I used before, because I always use that one. I'm going to get creative and think of something different. Here we go. This is cute. So one of the staff members gave me these little snow boots for Beckett, and he's not big enough for them yet. So they've been sitting in my classroom. But look at the bottom. How fun is that? So maybe I'll put some Beckett boots stamps in there. This can be his bowl when he gets older. That is so cool looking. It's got lines and spots. You can see a little bit closer. So now I have two textures on the surface. And you want it to be complex. Take the time. It takes seconds to do this, so don't skip this step. It's really going to make a big difference. And then maybe I'll run my finger over just the areas that feel a little bit too raised. Just so, ooh, that looks cool. Kind of drag my finger over that line. Create a different texture. And this could also be maybe the outside of the bowl. The outside of your bowl can be more textured because you don't have to eat out of that surface. And then when you press it, just be careful it's not too hard, because you don't want your slab to stick to your table. Now this is the tricky part. I don't want to lose the texture on this side, but I have to texturize the inside too. So the inside might not be able to be as texturized or deep. So maybe just a very light pressing. And you could do the same thing or you could do something different. I think I'm going to do the same thing just because for consistency. So I'm not really pushing right now. Really keeping it really, really shallow. I will give you guys time to work on this in a different class period. So today you're basically just watching me do this. So do my plaid pattern again. And this is the inside of the bowl, right? So I have to be careful about too much texture. Not really pushing right now. I'm just kind of letting it roll on the surface. And I'm doing this a lot more shallow than the other side because I don't want to lose it. I don't want to lose the texture on the other side, and I also don't want to have too deep of a texture. It's kind of funny to be using the bottom of a dirty shoe to put a stamp in your thing that you eat out of. Okay, I really like that. I would not have discovered that if I hadn't challenged myself to try something new. Okay, so before I pick this up, I have to decide what am I putting on the surface of my slump. It's either paper or plastic. I think I'm going to go with plastic because I really want to sort of preserve the texture that I have, and I don't want that paper texture. So I'm going to take a piece of plastic bag and I'm just going to try to drape it over the top. Okay, and then this is the part you have to just be very careful about. You don't want to break your slab and work it too much. Back this up. Okay, I'm going to find the center. And I'm just going to very carefully drape it over. Now this is the part where we have to figure out what am I doing with all this extra clay. Like you could say, oh, I like that, but I don't want you to go too simple on yourself here because this is going to be a crazy bowl. It's not going to be super functional. So what do I do if I really want it to take the shape? Well, first thing you're going to do is just very kind of delicately start from the top and mold it around your form. Get that air pocket out. And then just kind of start pressing around this top part. And you're going to have to cut away some of this clay and maybe dart it. But we'll have to figure out where that's going to be first after we press on this for a bit. You want your darting to be very even. So now I'm looking down on top of it. This is a good technique for building something too. If you wanted to sculpt something quickly, you could get a really simple form pretty quick. Okay, so now I have to do some cutting away here. Which means I'm going to have to clean up some seams later. So let me see if I can show you the part that I'm working on here. I'm going to just draw on here first before I cut. Okay, so I'm going to cut this. And then I'm going to flip this part up and kind of decide how much I need to cut off by overlapping it. And before I press it down, I'm going to have to do some scoring. So, okay, and then I'm going to cut this like that. So you can see here that I've got this overlapped part, and then I've left about an inch of overlap. And then I'm going to take a fork and I'm going to score the inside of that and score this. A little bit of water. I might have to texturize this part again. And then here is where I'm going to paddle it with whatever paddle you've invented for yourself. We'll go in and just take my finger and make it look like there's no seam there. You're going to have to clean up the other side after you take this off. You can use a little bit of a rib tool to make it look like that never happened. And texturize it, right? Take my boot. Okay, that never happened. I darted it and I closed the seam. So now I have to do that to my other wings here. And I realize class is almost over. I'm going to try to finish this part just so you can see. So I'm going to work quickly. So cut it, and then I'm closing it. And then I'm going to cut away, leaving about 1 inch of overlap, scoring it. A little bit of water, overlap, paddle, scrape, texturize. Cut, overlap, cut again, leaving that inch. Got all this beautiful extra clay. Where you wedge it, don't waste it. Score. A little bit of water, overlap, paddle, scrape. Screening speed ceramics here. And texturize. Cut. Got a little bit of an extra piece there I got to deal with. Overlap. Extra inch. Score. Yes, I want your slump mold to be the shape of your original object. So I don't want a bunch of floopy wings everywhere. I want you to learn how to do this, okay? That's part of what I'm teaching you and grading you on. Texturize. It's fun to hit things with a boot. Okay, and then there's like a little bit extra. You can feel that there's like these little winged things. So I really want you to kind of clean those up. So you might have to do a couple more darts here to close off that form. Don't worry about what this shape is yet. I made it longer so that I could pull it off and decide later what I wanted to do with it, with the rim. So just make sure you have extra so that you have something to work with. Okay, I've got a little bit more like extra right here, so I'm going to actually just create a dart, cut into it, lay it over, and this time I don't even need to cut anything off because it's so skinny. And this time I'm really going to like almost like shrink it to the shape. and get a nice tight lock right there. And now, yes, I am using things that you have around the house. Probably have a bucket or some form. You've got plastic garbage bags. Probably could find a piece of wood or something hard to hit this with. You have forks. I gave you this tool. This, you don't have a needle tool, but you could use a fork, or you could use anything sharp, really. Okay, so now I have to decide, is that good enough, or is there extra? I feel like there's one more dart I could make right here. You don't want it to be too tight though, because then you really could have trouble getting it off once it starts to dry. So this is the trick, right? When you start letting this dry, you have to really babysit it, and you have to pull it off when it's holding its shape, but it's not so dry that you can't pull it off anymore, right? Because it's going to start to shrink and sort of suction itself together on top of this form. And if that happens to you and you can't get your piece off and you have to break it, then that's part of the learning process, and yes, you have to start over. This is the part of the semester where I get a little bit more like, yes, you have to start over. Yes, you have to learn that technique. Yes, I want you to try again. Okay. All right, so I kind of retexturize that more. So if I pull this off right now, it wouldn't really hold up that great. And then I'm going to just a little paddling at the base here, because I really like that foot. I want it to impress in there. Okay, so that is the end of this, and I would drape this with some plastic, and I would babysit it, and before it gets completely leather hard and it's still kind of bendy, but it's holding its shape, I would lift it off and flip it over and wrap it up again, because we're going to add more to this, so it can't be too dry, so that we can cut into it and add things to it. All right. What will we use without a mold? This is a plastic bottle. You can find something in your house that you can mold this over. Okay, it's nothing special. Anything in your home could work. Any other questions? Doesn't have to be this big, but please don't make something that is 2 inches big. That doesn't really count. You're not going to learn this technique unless you choose something that's at least like 6 inches big. Okay, we're not making tiny things anymore, guys. We're getting a little bit bigger. It doesn't have to be this big. Oh, thanks, Zoe. He could probably fit into him in like by the time he's 2. All right, you guys, it's 11:35. Have a wonderful day. I'll see you on Thursday.